You go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be on this panel with friends and colleagues. I know I was asked to spend about 10 to 12 minutes to make a few points, and I'll try to do that, and then we'll open it up, obviously, for a discussion. The first point I want to make is really about the Biden administration. Obviously, this disaster started on the Biden administration's clock. And I want to start by reading you a paragraph I wrote right then in October 2023. It was a couple of weeks after Hamas's attack, and by then we have started to see the scale of the Israeli assault in Gaza. At that time, I wrote a piece for Brookings, and it was titled "Biden's Dangerous Stance on the war in Israel and Gaza." And I wrote that because it was really already beginning immediately to be clear why the U.S. is putting itself on a course toward disaster already in October. And I'll tell you, my thoughts were many, but I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs why I thought that we're putting ourselves on a track toward disaster. So I said, the Biden administration complete support for Israel's aim of, quote, destroying Hamas, unquote, seems understandable given Hamas's actions. But in practice, it is far more problematic than the president and the administration appear to appreciate. It is possible to weaken and hurt Hamas, but Israel's conflict with the Palestinians is ultimately a political one. And then I went on to say that if it's possible at all to destroy Hamas, if destroying Hamas is possible at all, it would probably entail destroying Gaza itself. That was obvious to me from October 2023. The moral implications alone, not to mention the severe violations of international law, should be enough to reject this mission. And I added that as the President of the United States, Biden cannot afford to back Israel's total freedom of action in Gaza. He cannot assume that Israeli aims fully coincide with those of the United States. As Biden himself had noted, this is the most extreme government in Israel's history, with prominent Jewish supremacist ministers whose stated aims conflict with both U.S. interests and values and seek an opportunity to expel Palestinians from what they see as the land of Israel, including Gaza. And that was clear in the. And so it was clear to me from the outset that was the course that we're being put on. And the thing about it is that you have to keep in mind that this is a time when things are in flux, when there is the shock of the Hamas attack, and then there is the next shock of the scale of the Israeli operations are beginning to be clear. Those are the times when narratives are formed. So the narrative that you put in place as the dominant narrative becomes the one that survives and impacts what you do, for just like after, the 9/11 attack, or what Bush would say and how this would happen. This is the formative. We had done a poll right after October 7, 2023. About within a week, I did a poll in the U.S., and there was a spike of sympathy with Israel among the American public. In fact, it was because I had done a poll before October 7th, and so I repeated the poll after, and there was a spike of sympathy. In fact, it was actually quite a significant spike of sympathy in comparison to the past polling. But within 2 weeks of that, within just 2 weeks, I did another poll repeating it, and all of that sympathy had evaporated. Most of it had evaporated. And among young Democrats, in fact, it shifted in another direction within 2 weeks. Okay, so it was quite a big difference in the way the public was forming its opinion. But this idea of we must destroy Hamas, or Hamas must be destroyed, wasn't just Biden's. It was adopted by the body politic, including most Democrats. In fact, I spoke in Congress to senators, Democratic senators, and this was a kind of like including people who were very sympathetic to the Palestinians, people who have been, very outspoken. They bought into this idea that Hamas must be destroyed, and therefore it puts you on a track toward, so Hamas isn't destroyed, so everything is just collateral damage that's acceptable because that's the mission that you have to do. There's no other win other than destroying Hamas. So I say this because now we have sort of the same kind of, how do you do a narrative when there is a crisis? We have now something emerging in the Trump administration I'll talk about a little bit later on. It is extremely important. But what Biden did was not just, if I have to look at the Biden administration, as I have, and I've written about it, and we have a forthcoming book on both Biden administration and the first Trump administration, I would say that aside from the obvious, which is like supplying the weapons that Israel was using in Gaza, it was really the formation of this narrative as a Democratic president, particularly, not only on this issue and what needs to be done to get to where the U.S. needs to get, but also on the assault on international organizations. And this is a president who got elected to defend international norms and human rights. He justified support for Ukraine, employing those issues. And then he has essentially an assault on these institutions. Every time there's a criticism of Israel that comes out of the International Criminal Court or the UN, the attack will go on those institutions. And the Biden administration, I think, employed the veto power in the UN Security Council over this issue 5 times between October 2023 and the time it left. Obviously the Trump administration just employed the veto power for the 6th time just recently. So clearly, I think I see Biden as having been a disastrous president on this issue, in part because he was a Democratic president, and so therefore he created a narrative that was hurtful to the U.S. internationally, hurtful to the power of international institutions that underpin the approach to an equitable approach to Israel-Palestine, and certainly hurtful in developing narrative within the U.S. that has enabled this kind of mindset. And by the time people woke up, you see Gaza is obliterated. It's too late. It's not something you can deal with. Now, I want to make 2 other points, one related to the Israeli-American relationship and one related to Trump policy. And on the Israeli-American relationship, I think that everybody knew this was the central issue for what happens on Israel-Palestine. It has been, obviously, without American support, Israel would not have been able to sustain its occupation and sustain the war in Gaza. And obviously this has happened on Democratic and Republican administrations alike over decades. But I don't think any one of us, including those of us like me who have been part of this political process and writing about it for decades, appreciated how dependent Israel would become on the United States. I think one of the things that we're talking about how much the U.S. has supported Israel, but I don't think we are appreciating the extent to which Israel demonstrated it is dependent on America for doing what it does. I don't think we've appreciated it. I mean, if you just take a stock of what the U.S. have had to do since 2023, not just in terms of over $30 billion spent in military efforts to help Israel, but even to restock Israeli supply. I mean, remember, this was not by measure of warfare. This was not the 1973 war or the 1967 war against states. This was against essentially a militia in Gaza. The fact that the Israelis needed to be resupplied on a regular basis, even coming out of the U.S. stockpiles, the fact that the U.S. had to become actively involved in defending Israel from rockets, the fact that even with the Houthis, who are considered to be another militia out in Yemen, the U.S. had to deploy 1/10 of its entire naval fleet to go address that, to spending over $1 billion of munitions alone in attacking the Houthis. I mean, when you put that in perspective, and then you put in perspective all of the international efforts, including the vetoes that have been employed, you would appreciate the extent to which Israel has become even more dependent on the U.S. than we ever appreciated. This is really extraordinarily important, I think, to keep in mind. It's important to read for the following reason, because simultaneous with that, and despite the increasing American aid, Israel has lost favor in much of the world. And I think we're talking about the polling. What you see internationally, the Pew poll that was just released is extraordinary, because in every European country, views of Israel are not just negative, but highly negative. I mean, we're talking about 75% negative versus 19% positive in places like Spain, in places like the Netherlands, even in places like Japan, 79% negative, places like Australia, over 70% negative. You're talking about extraordinary drop in the way the world sees it, and that makes Israelis even more secure, given what the nature of the dependence on the U.S. And then to boot, Israel has lost the American public. And those of you who follow the polls, I'm not going to mention mine. I'll mention Pew. And Pew, for the first time, they showed 53% of the American public has negative views of Israel. And shockingly, while Republicans still are the only segment that have more positive than negative views, Republicans under 50 years of age, not under 35, not under 30, Republicans under 50 years of age have negative views of Israel. Now, in a poll by Gallup, you have 59% of Democrats say they sympathize more with Palestinians than with Israel, and only 19% say they sympathize more with Israel than with the Palestinians. So there's a huge difference, and that huge difference means more Israeli insecurity at a time that it's much more dependent on the United States. And it needs the U.S. not only to fight its battles internationally in places where it is losing, and obviously more action, and even in America, where critics of Israel obviously have been very noisy and likely to be more. I would add one more thing to it, which is that I know what everybody has been watching in Gaza has been horrific, and just it's hard even to fathom that it could get worse. It could get worse because this is not over, and we're going to face more and more challenges that are going to test the U.S. So I'm going to just finally say something about the Trump administration and its policy. Obviously, in my, what I've written about it in the past about the first Trump administration, the president himself is always an enigma, and he doesn't follow these issues very closely. And in the first administration, for example, we know that he was very easily manipulable, and he relied specifically on top aides that he trusted, and those top aides really kind of with help shaped American policy toward Israel-Palestine. In this particular case, I see the same thing, and everything that we see indicated indicates that it's moving in that direction, including, for example, Khaled just mentioned how under the Bush administration, when you had then Crown Prince Abdullah write a letter to President Bush saying, unless you kind of correct course on this, we need to, we're going to reconsider policy. And I could tell you at the time, by the way, I was actually invited right after that to the White House with 3 other colleagues, including 2 former ambassadors to the Middle East and another think tanker, by Condoleezza Rice. We had a big meeting. She convened a White House meeting, including Steve Hadley, then her deputy, the Vice President Cheney's staff, then William Burns, who was at the time was Assistant Secretary of State. And she said up front, she wanted to hear ideas. She said, our policy is not working. We need to reboot. That was the kind of the thing that was happening. But consider what is happening now with the Trump administration. He goes to Saudi Arabia on his first major trip to outside. He went to Rome, obviously, for the Pope's funeral, but this was his big one. And he got a lot from the Saudis. He gave the Saudis, gave him a lot, but he got, they got something out of him, particularly on Syria, which is it. Don't underestimate that was a big thing because it went against the norms and expectations in Washington. They got something out of him, but got nothing on this issue from him. And look at what they've just done today. They've just warned people against attending the conference on Palestine next week. They warned countries against attending or participating in that conference on Palestine, even though the Saudis are the co-organizers of this conference. So keep that in mind. I would just say one more thing about Trump. And I have more to say on it, by the way. I have an article coming out with Mark Lynch next week on this specific issue of Trump and the conference that's coming in New York. But if I had to bet, I would bet that it'll be the same course he's been on. But I would just say Trump is obviously unpredictable. And in ways that have gone against the Syria decision was really remarkable. It's nothing short of remarkable. There was no anticipation of that within the State Department, in the White House, in Congress, in Washington, by Israel. It came out of the blue, and he's sticking to it. He's pushing forward to it. The same thing, by the way, with the renewal of negotiations with Iran over the Iran nuclear deal. This happened. He didn't consult. He made it happen, and he's pursuing it. Now, obviously, whether he gets there or not is another story. But it is a wild card that we all cannot really predict. But if you had to look at it in terms of just the trends, and I think I don't see anything but doubling down on the policy that he inherited from Biden.